What's up there, Workforce? Chris here with Work To Game, and it's a day off of Final Fantasy XIV, so I wanted to have a post for you guys that kind of just dove into something for those of you looking for your 14 fix today as we go into patch 4.5 tomorrow. And so we are going to talk about some hidden stories behind Eureka. And so this comes from an interview, and the original article, I'll have the source right here. I'll put the link in the description. It was translated by Tsunari96. Thank you so much. The amount of times that Brian and I rely on other people to translate things from Japanese so we can bring them to you guys until we know Japanese, which without us learning it seems unlikely. This is really awesome. So I thought I'd be the one to kind of take charge on this as the one who spent more time in Eureka between Brian and I, but just know that, like, of the two of us, I'm not the lore guy, so I find it fascinating. So we'll be kind of coming at it from that angle. So we'll go question by question and then kind of my thoughts, and then we'll wrap this up. So the interview is just in a Google Docs. That's what I'm going to be linking to, and it's real easy to go back and read. I'm going to be skimming it, so there's a lot here. It's nice and long. The responses are incredibly lengthy. So the first question is, please tell us what was going on that led up to developing the Forbidden Land Eureka. Kind of what set the tone for this. And Yoshida says, well, we didn't really have a specific plan. We knew that we wanted to build something big, right? Lots of people, and kind of pick up, it sounds like they wanted to pick up where Diadem left off. That kind of get everybody in there. But Diadem didn't really do it. Diadem didn't really perfectly go into exploration, and you needed to fix that. You would have had to have something that played well outside of the standard rules of 14. And Eureka has done that. It has been a huge public test realm for them as far as jacking with the battle system. Along with other reasons, this is what led to Eureka. So they also said, from a lore perspective, they wanted to do some stuff with Labyrinth of the Ancients and all that, but because that story had already finished up by the time they were thinking about this, this is their chance to go back and revisit that. So for those of you lore ones, hopefully this kind of experience has allowed you to go back and answer some questions that maybe you had. They really wanted to use it in any way possible. So still very, very broad. This first question is very broad, but they asked Mr. Oda, who ends up kind of being referred to as actually, Mr. Nakagawa ends up being the director of this. So they asked Mr. Oda to build lore, and then Nakagawa to build it, and that's going to establish the connection between Eureka and the Isle of Val, and that's going to allow them to develop this into something large, multiplayer, that is unlike anything else in the game. That is the objective here. That is the core goal of what's set out on this. So they're going to set out, and they wanted something that would be able to be played within a permitted time. So when you talk about, like, savage raids and all that, how do I have room to play something else, right? So it needs to be something that I can bite off little chunks as I play through it, and I will gain progression, right? That's what the relic weapon has always done for this franchise, is it has filled in the gaps where you don't have to have a 5-hour play session available. You can log on, clear a little bit, log on at a separate time, clear a little bit. But Diadem fell short in there. So, you know, my question as I was reading this was already, how are you going to do that versus Diadem? And they said, well, we said we can do much better. And as a core Final Fantasy XI player, which explains a lot of the tone of Diadem, of Eureka, they say, you know, I want to take charge on this. I want to be the director of Eureka. So that's how the team formed. So we know that we want it to involve more players. We know we want it to pick up where Diadem left off, but do everything that Diadem fell short of. And we know that to do that, we have to be willing to break all the rules in the battle system, and we need to have somebody on the team willing to take charge of that, who's going to take ownership of the fact that this is not just going to be a rollout of basically savage light that you can pick up and drop off whenever you want. And so far, this all makes sense to me, because I have a lot of questions about how Eureka ended up in the state where it did. So let's dive into our next question. So the next question is nice and short. When I actually got to play Eureka, it felt as if it was a totally different game inside of 14. I will agree with that statement. I was surprised in thinking there's no patch like this. Was this originally intended? And Nakagawa said, to think that, yes, the only concept was creating miniature content that you could enjoy the classic MMO experience. So if you think back to EverQuest, WoW Classic, Final Fantasy XI, these big long grinds where it's just you and other people, and the only complexity to it is the social engagement that builds around the player base. The game itself is just go out there and kill something. A big guy's going to spawn, figure it out. So that's what he wanted to create, and it's just meant to be chaos. So I think if that was the goal, they nailed it. Whether or not I like how they did it, that's still up for debate. And then they asked, hunting while keeping track of your schedule too. Well, they did intentionally adjust the Final Fantasy XI scale, right? They scaled it to where it could fit within 14. So the fact that you can still queue and it tosses you into this set zone, and then parties form relatively easily, and then you're kicked out within this reasonable amount of time. I think all of that played into how do we make 11 more palatable for a 14 player, but still stay true to that very classic MMO grind where you can bite off just a little bit at a time and feel this slow progression, and the sense of achievement is almost self-defined, not put in by the game. What did you do to differentiate from Diadem, as both are similar MMO content? Well, this is a weird question in my mind, only from the standpoint of currently in this game, there is no use of a previous relic system outside of the glamour and just the completionism of doing it for going back. So in my mind, these are just kind of fully encapsulated like chapters, and they get closed all the way up and then set to the side. And so the ARR relic is done. The Heavensward relic is done. And now the Stormblood is going to be done. And then we will get Shadowbringers. And so they don't really have any connection with each other. It's one of my bigger complaints about the system. So in the nature of that question, our minds were more about recapturing the good parts of the classic MMO experience. So they didn't have Diadem much in their mind. So they didn't really... They said, you know, what was good and bad, and reflected that in, but their sole goal was to go towards 11. So if you wonder why in many ways it feels very different than Diadem, that's because the parts of Diadem that carried over seem to be more by accident than by design, and it really just seems to be how can we take 14 and shove an aspect of, not 11 specifically, but of a Final Fantasy experience of that era. It doesn't sound like they wanted to create exactly 11 with the battle classes and the trusts and everything like that. It seems more like they wanted to say, what are the things about 11 that made it feel tonally so different than 14? Why was there just an entire different pace to the game? And what is it about this, they keep using this term, classic MMO experience, that made it unique to Eureka, or to then, that we can shove into Eureka? If you could tell us what is good and bad about it. Well, Diadem started as feel free to do whatever you want, and then it became too much freedom. And so they wanted to give guidance to the progression. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Diadem sounded out like, oh, you can do whatever you want, but then because it was like limited people to the instance, it's like, oh, well, but if they do this, like, we have this same issue when we talk about like, oh, they should, it's the same conversation with damage meters. Well, they should just make it optional, and then people who don't want it won't have to do it. As somebody who does want damage meters in the game, I disagree with that concept, because once you give freedom to everybody, the general population will make a decision, and then that will affect everybody's. So the people who don't want damage meters in the game, they're going to feel it, whether they want them or not, because there's going to be too many of us that use them to ignore. And so I can understand how their goal here was to get away from that freedom. When I learned that, we decided to make Eureka say, it'll open up as you go. And so it just keeps freeing more and more. I'm not sure that worked out. I'm glad that that statement was made, because I understand what they were doing with these kind of zones unlocking, but I don't feel that it added enough capabilities and enough of like almost like a puzzle that you're unfolding to really feel engaging content. It just felt like you unlocked the ability to do the same grind you just did. But now you're going to get to click a thing once, and then that's it. So that's kind of how Eureka felt to me. So it's interesting to hear that that's what the goal was, knowing that in my mind, the implementation didn't hit that. So that tells me that if they go at the next relic grind with the exact same theory, we could have a very different result. And it wasn't the theory that was flawed. It was that Eureka was just not quite there. It was a lot to bite off, and so maybe they can learn from that. They can take the exact same team, the exact same mindset, and get an even better product out of just going through this iteration one more time with a lot more knowledge under their belt. Last time we had an interview with Yoshi P, he said something along the line of, Eureka's our experimental field. Very much. Players certainly got the impression that it was different from any other content. Yeah, we didn't really expect any specific impression, but we were surprised how they explored different ways of enjoying the content. So I think that he's talking about the train. So, you know, it sounded like he was just like, ugh. And that's the problem, is it's easy to say, I know this one guy that will go out and explore this and dive into it and read all the lore. But the vast majority of people are going to view it as one more check mark. How do I get to my relic weapon? And I can go back and try to enjoy it after the fact, but then they never will. And so the vast majority of people are going to push through it as fast as possible in the simplest way possible. And it's the path of least resistance. And so the fact that they wanted people to explore different ways of leveling is not something that's come to be. It's the exact same with leveling alts. Brian and I talk all the time about how you can go do leaves, you can go do fates, you can go do... And people lose their mind when we are saying not everybody, but there is a handful of people in the community that really are so good about explaining the optimal way of doing things to beginners that it's almost lost how much variety there is in this game. And so I'm sure it must be frustrating from a development end to say, okay, I spent all this time developing 27 different ways to level, and people are only doing the optimal 2, right? Oh, you're supposed to do deep dungeon during these level ranges. Anything but that and you're a scrub. I don't know that that's the right attitude to take to this game, and I think the fact that they took that idea and said, okay, we've added 27 different ways to level, let's do 27 different ways to level in Eureka, that is not how we enjoyed it. We found the most optimal, and because it is... the NMs are best killed by a group, and there is a limited number of players in there, and you all need to kill that thing, there isn't any ability for me to go off and level the way I want, because I can't invite my friends into my instance. It's shockingly harder than it needs to be, considering the way open world zones work. So I think the party finder really let it down if this was their goal. So we'll keep moving on. It was easy to party up on the spot, since 14 let players invite party from Shout, probably why the tribe thing could flourish. Thanks to Eureka, letting Eureka players create parties within the instance, something that Diadem explored, the tribe thing happened. Yes, I must credit this to Nakagawa. So what he starts talking about here is kind of what is the goal here? What is intended? So when you talk about social aspects within a game, there's something nice about things like Party Finder because they get you to your content much faster and you have more dungeons being run per player and per server than ever before. But the downside of that is you can end up with this kind of social, like, degrading down to whatever the most common way of play is. And anybody outside of that can feel peer pressured into not knowing. So instead of telling players what you need to do, you just need to be able to make sure that whatever they want to do is going to be possible. So I really didn't feel that they answered this question in quite the way I had hoped. I was hoping that they said, I have an idea how to make these work, and then we'll work on it now. I don't think they do. I don't think they understand how to make the social aspect within Eureka work. I think that it's neat that this kind of... There's a lot of ERP in there, but it's neat that this social aspect has popped up for the people who enjoyed that. So I know people in our community like Jelly really and Sparta got a lot of joy out of sitting in there. And I know a lot of you kind of enjoyed the social aspects, but when they say, like, it was easy to party up on the spot, yes, but it still wasn't easy to invite my friends. It still wasn't easy to go back and level with my friends. And so you say I can do whatever I want, but what I want to do is go help Brian catch up, and I still can't do that. First time I entered the instance all by myself, and I found myself in a party with everyone else was surprising. Yes, it was a different experience for sure. Yes, it is. It's crazy to be in these, like, huge parties and you're running around. One of my favorite things of Eureka is how you run around and there's just dozens and dozens and dozens of characters all standing everywhere, and you see all these different mounts and all these different glamours. So I think that's awesome that you have just these massive parties that pop up. There's this just train that just that is my favorite part of Eureka. That's the one thing they did well. We hope to introduce this in 4.1, but it ended up in 4.25. So this is something that you can't create, but once you create, it's up to a development team to engage with or not. So when you see something like this pop up, you have two choices. You can ignore it, and it can die off because it doesn't have the support to sustain, or you can lean into it and you can make sure that there's a gap for that to form in every future piece of content. WoW had this with fishing raids. Fishing raids were entirely an exploit that turned into a hidden gem within the social construct, which became, in the next expansion, a piece of content that was really meant to foster that. So hopefully the social aspects of Eureka are something they lean into in the next expansion. It sounds like they are aware of it, and while they may not have liked some of the behavior that came out of it, that if they design the content not to necessarily create that behavior, but still create the groups, we could have a really neat Relic experience in the next expansion. I suppose Eureka showcases some of the charms of first-gen MMO because the system was put with so much effort. Was there anything you would say, this is a success in any recreations? The death penalty had mixed opinions, but I'm glad we had it implemented. I 100% agree. Making people ask for reses, making it hurt when you don't get a res, making it hurt not to run with other people is what made you rely on strangers. So I am 100% glad that they said, yes, people are going to complain, and it's a lot like a kid complaining they have to eat their vegetables. They'll thank you for it later. It's a better gaming experience, and even though it sucks, and even though, like in WoW, when you get killed somewhere and you have to run back to your body, and in 14, when you die and you lose experience, and in, you know, oh gosh, in Eve, when you die and your ship is gone, like, and in Diablo, when you die, you lose experience. Like, when you think back to some of the best stories within your gaming, wherever you've come from, prior to 14. Your favorite gaming memories. They're always the hard times. They're always the raid boss you couldn't get past, the time that you died a bunch, and then you've got a great piece of loot. And so hardship is what kind of brings those groups together. And so you don't want to foster a very, like, Dark Souls, it needs to just be ridiculous. Super Meat Boy, in many ways Mario, just drives me bat crazy that I can't clear a level. But you do want to kind of foster a little bit of that hardship, because that's what gives you ownership of your community, your character, and that's what gives you ownership of what you've completed. I got to this level within Eureka. I earned that. It wasn't just handed to me by showing up and rolling my face on the keyboard until it got there. I could have died. And so, yes, unfortunately, it resulted in people being a little too afraid of death, and you ended up with a train forming, but it goes into our next question here. There were shouts for Raise, and some players enjoyed the experience of running around and helping Raise. Slash shout, huge in Eureka. Absolutely huge. I think death penalty being in was great, and I think that the entire thing, they talk about it adding suspense, and they talk about, you know what, we were back and forth, let's just do it, and let's just put the death penalty in. And they said put it in and went with it. Own that. I think they did a great job here. The suspense of death and a desperate wish to get a raise when you got incapacitated, it was something you could only experience nowhere in 14 but in Eureka. So I keep talking about other games, and the reason I talk about other games is because outside of Eureka, I can't relate this to any other part of 14. I can't say, oh, this is like Deep Dungeon, because it's not. You don't lose anything. You lose the whole run, but you don't lose partial. You don't lose experience. You don't. Oh, if you cleared to level 60 on your last Deep Dungeon run, you die at level 50, your Deep Dungeon, the character you're leveling goes backwards because you didn't get as far as you did last time. There isn't anything that's as hardcore as this. And so I have to compare it to other games like 11, like Blizzard games, like games I played before I played Square games. So when you think about back to, I mean, I played Eve back in the day. When you think back to your favorite gaming experiences that are in the past for their own reasons, right? So I don't play a lot of those games anymore, but that one aspect of them is what gives me some of my favorite stories. So I think it's really exciting that 14 is trying to find another way to give me really great stories. I would love to see some aspect of dungeons take on this level of challenge, some level of how fast can you clear it with nobody dying, and we're going to make it, we're going to have it scale up, or some form of like a savage type system brought to the four-mans that says, hey, we're going to make this real hard, and if you die, it's going to reset, and that way you have to keep going back and keep going back, so that when you clear it, there's this sense of like, I did that. I really did it. And not just I showed up and square-handed it to me. It really gets on your nerves when you're venturing in dangerous areas when a single death takes 12 million experience away from elemental level 50. Yeah. The good times wouldn't be good if there wasn't times of just sheer frustration like this. Speaking of that, what was the essence of the first gen MMO experience from both Mr. Yoshida and Mr. Nakagawa expected to experience in Eureka? There are several, but most importantly, I wanted to see was leaving players on their own and allowing them to kind of do their own thing, right? Recreating the old school MMO experience. What happens if we just give them stuff to kill and no direction? They found out. The North American servers find the easiest way to kill it and just mob up and bully it down, and we risk nothing. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting social experiment. I think a little more direction could have been used, but just a tiny bit. I still like how free it is. With the Forbidden Land Eureka as an experiment field, it seemed like there were many interesting data found, like how do modern gen MMORPG communications look like? Yes, so like one of the things that this is a neat exploration into is the easiest thing to compare Eureka to is 11, and anything about Eureka you like that wasn't 11, it's easiest to compare it to either the rest of 14 or another game. Eureka really is the one piece of content that I find the easiest to quickly draw comparisons with games outside of Square Enix, and I think that's a great sign that they're doing something so different than themselves that the only things you have to draw on are totally different experiences. Instead of being like, oh yeah, this is like that other thing you do. So I like that. It is interesting to think what happens when we bring 11 up to today, because a lot of things we think about 11 seem like design decisions, but a fair number of those design decisions, keep in mind, may have been based on hardware or software limitations of the time. So when we talk about things like the way people communicate, the way people party up, /shout, the size of an instance, things like that, those are all things that when 11 was out and was the hot thing, and it was the only MMO and 14 didn't exist, there were things in there that we now do in 14, and we're like, oh yeah, the 11 people chose not to do that. I think it's so much better that way. It's possible the 11 people wanted some of the things, like some of the communication servers. It's possible that dev team wanted these things. They weren't possible. So it's interesting to think, well, if we could recreate 11 now, what would be different? Would we have HD textures? That seems obvious. Would we have the same backend capabilities, the ability to jump between servers, world visit system? Is that something that 11 would have taken on? So, when we talk about conversations like remastering 11, and re-releasing 11 as a new thing instead of just carrying it on, it's interesting to think, do you recreate it as it was, or do you recreate it as those developers would have built it today? Regardless, it seemed quite interesting that we have one huge experiment going on now as a game that doesn't have PTRs. I agree. Like observing players' behaviors feels like something completely new and different is ahead of us. Personally, as growing in a game designer, it was a valuable experience as I worked on Eureka. There were challenges, but I'm glad to be a part of it. So now they're going to kind of talk about voices from Pagos and Anemos. So this is going to be a little bit more directed questions as I kind of skimmed over these. So this is kind of a good point to, if you have any comments about just Eureka, kind of write those down, keep that in mind, start that in the comments below, and then we'll keep moving because this video is going to be very long. Okay, so the first question is, looking back when Forbidden Land Eureka Anemos was first released, what was the impression and feedback like? The first thing they noticed is that there were way more players playing it than expected. That seems weird because it's a whole new type of content. This expansion was largely dominated by Eureka for anybody that was not a savage raider and put significant hours into this expansion. If you weren't doing Eureka and you weren't raiding, this expansion may have felt very light to you. The dev team always paid attention to the active players, but there were so many more than anticipated. And then they basically said, you know, there were people who didn't like it, and then they kind of dropped out, but then they came back. And you notice that they came together for NMs. Was this what was intended? And they say, yeah, this is what was intended. 14 is 14, and our players are 14 players. The classic MMO we tried to recreate would have been a little out of reach, and so, you know, they intended to basically say it's not meant to be competition, but at least the 14 players will recognize this as being somewhat like a fate. And so they get together for the clear. We heard in the last interview with Mr. Yosh P that Pagos was developed without the feedbacks from Animos. Yes. And that is something that it's easy to forget in game development, because we're not all game developers, right? I know just enough to know how little I know, and that's about it. And if you think about writing a book, right? So you're writing this book, and you write it for years, and you send it off to your editor, and they send it back to you with thoughts, and you build through those thoughts, and then you go to get it printed. Well, the editor's going to make another pass through it. They're going to look for typos. Maybe in this case, something this large. They're going to send it through legal, make sure that there's nothing in there that gets you in trouble, nothing that's either offensive or is copyright or something like that by accident, to make sure you're not opening yourself up to any problems. Then you're going to start, in this case, talking about the technical things. So imagine you're having to get your book cover designed, and you're having to decide what kind of paper you want it printed out, and, you know, do you want it paperback, hardback, and all these things. And the author may or may not have a lot of control over that, but somebody's making all these decisions. Where will it sell? When will it sell? How do we market it? All of that. And that all starts, and that takes months. And then meanwhile, you're getting it ready for printing, and you get it through the presses, and then you ship it to all the stores. And then we have our big release date, and we have our book tour, and we go around and we meet the people, and they give us feedback and all that. But think, we stopped writing months ago. Months and months. So when you think about, you know, the rate at which we got Eurekas, by the time we were giving feedback and playing the content, if they were not already almost done designing the next one, it would have been late. So without knowing their exact timetables, this makes sense to me, and it's one of the things that in the back of my mind I tried to have a little bit of empathy for, but I still felt the same frustration everybody else did. So what feedbacks from Animos were reflected in Pyro's direction and development? Probably the most overdone recreation of a classic MMO experience, including the parts that made it harsh. We wondered, will this be okay? And yeah, anytime you make things hard. One of my biggest complaints about the 14 dev cycle is not that the game is too hard sometimes, and it's not that the game is too easy sometimes. It's that they'll take a patch and they'll make the raid too easy at the normal level, the alliance raid that we all just jump into, and then the next one will be kind of unforgiving, and then the players will all complain because they can't get past it, and they'll die on like a math boss, right? And everybody dies. And if the difficulty could be more, this is easier said than done, could be more level, I think that what would happen is as new players came in, they would be brought up and carried by the other players up to the level we're expected of, no matter what that level is, and then we could just hold that level. And you can adjust it slightly. What you can't do is this, and I think that's where a lot of the complaints come from. Oh, well, the last relic weapon you just, in my opinion, handed to me, and now this one, you're taking away my experience. So if they want it to be this harsh, then the 5.0 relic needs to be as hard or harder than Eureka. And that will make people that complained about this go, oh, that's just how hard relic is now. Compared to Animos, it felt more close to the explore and pick a good hunt spot like the classic MMO. Yes. Yes, and based on everything we've read up to this point, that was the goal. The landscape, which was beautiful. Gosh, this might have been single-handedly the most beautiful zones they've ever put in 14, which is already one of the single-handedly most beautiful MMOs ever brought to market. Like, great job, Square. Absolutely. And so they go on to talk about how the culture around this kind of formed, because keep in mind, the groups got bigger as we moved on. So Animos certainly had it easier for people who didn't communicate with the kind of the big group culture, the tribe culture. So yes, players seemed to play more on their own. I think especially if you played day one, the way you played was more up to however you wanted to play. It didn't really matter if it was optimal. But as things got bigger, it felt like people, the amount of time that the day one experience, the like fresh experience lasted, got shorter and shorter. Because people went in and were like, yeah, we know how to do this now. Let's just get into it. I mean, you would walk in on day one, within an hour, people were asking like, oh, where's this group and where's this? And I mean, they just expected right on patch day it to go right back to how the previous chapter was. So there were many players who entered Animos because Pyros was released. And I think each time they released a chapter, it drew people back in. And I think they got better. Obviously, you know, Animos and Pagos, you didn't see much of a change. But I think by the time you get to Pyros, you're seeing a big change. Was Logos actions supposed to be introduced in Animos? Yes. So we originally had plans for the Magia board and Logos actions prior to the 4.0 launch, which was later implemented in Pyros. One of my issues with Eureka this whole time was how little transparency I feel that they had on the front end. It was always retroactive. Yeah, we talked about this before, but then we weren't ready to tell you guys. I don't know when they would have done it. I don't think it belongs in a live letter, but knowing that this was kind of coming and what the plans were, I say that, but looking back, we probably would have read too much into it. Anything that didn't come out on the days they planned for, we would have been upset about. But it did feel frustrating. So I think there was a lose-lose there in like when things weren't quite ready the way they intended, they released it. We felt it was partial. We complained. They said, deal with it. That sucked. So they originally planned on the Magia board. They originally planned on this 11 experience. They originally planned on a lot of things, and I think they got implemented slowly. And that's kind of where this question and answer makes me at least sympathize to say, okay, so you're aware of why we were upset because you internally were also probably upset. Mr. Yoshida said in his first, the original atmosphere was simple, old school MMO, but there will be new things added. Yes. But the new things seem to be centered on things like community and things like, what are things we couldn't have done back then to kind of carry that mindset into the 14 era of capabilities. One thing that was impressive about Logos was that there was 50 different actions in the sense of them being optional. Yes. Does that, I don't know if that was a question. Does that mean that the Logos actions will be necessary to progress through the next part of Eureka? Probably, but it won't be the majority. Will it be mandatory at point? Not likely. If we restrict it like that, we'll end up repeating the same result as Pagos. One of the issues with Eureka is that you have to balance. So on one hand, you want everybody to play through this progression and feel that they're getting to carry it forward. On the other hand, you don't want to do the same thing to Eureka that you do to main story, where you've got so much back here that you've then gated people to say, I can't jump in at the end because I'll never catch up. Especially since there's no levels, like the level sync kind of, there should have been a level sync from day one so that it always, whenever Brian wanted to hop in, I could go back and help him. So to get to this point in the game, it feels like they're just now figuring out what Eureka is supposed to be. And that's only weird because we're talking about finishing up Eureka. By any means, Logos Actions seems to just be the spice on top of the content's freedom. You don't have to go too far to clear the content. There's more here, so it's probably good enough for people who really want to go deeper. So the next Eureka content is patch 4.55, it seems. At least not patch 4.5. We managed to wrap up all the work for 4.5, but we're not pushing that kind of step too soon. Guys, keep in mind how big 4.5 is. 4.5 has Blue Mage releasing a week late in it. It has the final Alliance raid, the final trial, the beginnings of the wrap-up of our MSQ. 4.55 is going to be huge. I think it's brilliant that this is on a half patch with Hildebrand and everything. Because this is going to allow us to carry 4.5 to 5.0 because that's a big stretch. If they dropped it all on day one, you'd cherry pick the content you liked and then you'd just be bored. So this kind of says, hey, bite off everything as they give it to us. I think this was really clever. Even if it was ready, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's literally sitting on our clients ready to go. This is the right pacing. Now that Pyros has patched our players' receptions, about the expected level of enjoyment. It seems what we learned from the experience of making Animos and Pagos lived up to that. I think that one of the things that it feels like the development team has done based on this kind of answer here is that it feels like they've honed in on at least the better feedback mechanism to better gauge and understand, which means that when they release something, they expect it to be X disappointing, X exciting. And that's a good place to be, that in touch with what your player population is going to like and not like, because that's what allows them to go back and say, hey, We can look for things that are going to break the balance. We can look for things that are going to break the balance system, the battle system. We can look for things that are going to increase loot. And so they can start to gauge our behavior and help kind of make sure that they're taking care of our gaming experience, to make sure that it's not too fast, it's not too slow, it's a certain amount of joy. Because in a way, they're a lot like a set of parents, and we're the kids. We just want to eat all our ice cream first and be done with it. And it's their job to make sure that we grow up into full-grown adult players with a nutritious, back-filled gaming experience that gives us the skill sets and the maturity to handle the harder content. That if we just eat an ice cream at the beginning and be handed epic weapons for doing nothing, we wouldn't have known how to handle. So if they want to create better players, then it is absolutely up to them understanding our player receptions to get that. Like using this Logos Reflect in the hunt or destructive damage Minera with the Logos Charge. Yeah, they thought of those. I don't know that all these are questions. Going from Pagos to Pyros, Happy Abundance seemed to be a lot better. Now that gives experience too. Yeah, in Pagos it was like, what? Quite frequent as well. Some, however, has the opinions that it might have hurt the population who focus on NM spawn kill. Okay. Focusing on bunny coffers seems to be more of a trend right now because you can get things that you can't get, like logo shards or profit. It won't always be profitable. So one of the things that I'm worried about is they say they're worried because possibly backfires to new, like when you have a trend. The problem with a trend is that what do we do when they're talking about all these things in short term? So my follow-up question to this question is, you can do whatever you want to do. There's things that are trends and all that, but like if you don't enjoy that content while it's the trend, how is that content ever enjoyable again? They didn't design any of this in a way where we're going to be able to come back during Shadowbringers and this is going to be like the most fun thing. It just wasn't designed with that in mind. Price seems to be stabilizing. Yeah, I mean, that's the nature. The drop rate and price stabilization are something that every item goes through. Logos action combination is quite interesting to toy around with. Do you have any plans to take it out of Eureka and implement it elsewhere into a similar system? We will never implement anything similar to the Logos action system. I think they did learn a lot about it. So I think they were wrong. So when we talk about the Logos system and we talk about Eureka in general and how Eureka compares to the open world, one of the interesting things is to think about the fact that it's so different than the battle system. And when we look at the actions list and we say, wow, where else could we use something that breaks the action system, has way too many skills, has actions that don't play nice with all the rest of content? I think that the parts they enjoyed about Eureka and the desire to bring them out in the open world is what led to Blue Mage. And I think it's what led to realizing the limited job system is how you take Eureka and you put it out in the open world and you make it sustainable. The limited job system took what we liked about Eureka and made it to where I can now have that on a character that stays with every expansion and doesn't just die off when the next, when the next 0.0 drops. So, yes, I think there were a lot of actions that were just too cool. Great feedback. I don't know that that's a question totally intended. Yes. A lot of these questions here, I'm not sure are questions. They seem to just be statements. I think that what they're talking about here is like what will become more prevalent in the next Eureka, and it's like, well, we found out about the true intentions once that's out. So I think that when we talk about like the strength of each job and changing their roles and kind of how things play, the ability to jack with things and the ability to say tanking as a ninja warrior or a red mage, when you talk about like, hey, we have these 11 experiences or whatever game, 15, another game we played from another developer and we like their take on something and we don't want to copy it, but like what I was picturing was like, that would be so much cooler if this part of our system played with it. oh, well, then we'll just do it. So when you see something respond, and it's not in a vacuum, I think that the idea of, you know, are things too powerful? Are things balanced within Eureka? What happens when you make something faster than a mount? What happens when you make the synergy between classes weird? What happens when you jack with classes? What happens when you jack with groups and you jack with monsters and you make people raise and you take away experience? And anything they choose to do in any Eureka or future form of Eureka, going into hidatos, it doesn't matter what they do in hidatos. Like literally anything new in hidatos, or anything new in, if they literally just take Eureka and pick it up and drop it in 5.0, everything they do in there to jack with your rotation, jack with your mechanics, is a chance to say, does this work? And if it doesn't, just patch it out. We very much saw them say, hey, we didn't like this in one chapter of Eureka, so it just won't go into the next one. Or we'll add it into the next one. So seeing the way Eureka can progress, it feels really logical that that's their PTR, and that's their chance to say, if people don't like it, they'll forget all about it in a few months. And so I see a lot of statements here, but I think the real question is, do you expect 5.0's Eureka, or whatever it is, do you expect 5.0 to have content like this that you can learn from? And what are some things that you think you learned from having access to this that you wouldn't have learned otherwise? Exploration in Battle in Eureka, the final series, hidatos. Let me take a quick little break here, and then we'll pick right back up. So the first question is, 14 battle content has the fun of learning mistakes, getting through mechanics, rotations, maximizing your output, right? And when you're in Eureka, all you do is repeat your damage rotation and continuous hunting, and it's mundane and boring. Are you going to change that? They expected that reception. Good. Would have been weird if that caught them off guard. And actually, they like that it makes it, I can just turn on a movie and say, I might as well be online. Which means that, in a way, for those of you that watched me when I power leveled through Eureka, I was behind, and they were about to release the second chapter. And so I leveled up through the whole Animos for Pagos, and then I did Pagos the day it launched. And I did all of that, and I did it so they'd announced BFA, and I decided I was going to play WoW. And so the way I leveled in Eureka was I hopped in the train, and a few of you in the community, until I had my mount unlocked, Sparta and Jelly namely, gave me rides, and I went monster to monster, and I had a picture-in-picture of me leveling in WoW, and then I leveled my fishing in WoW, and all of that while playing this. And then when I got to a boring point in WoW, and I was just leveling my fishing because I had to level it up, I was casting the fish, checking on the train, and then playing Pokemon Let's Go. I was playing Pokemon Quest, or I was playing Mario Odyssey. I felt a little bad about it. Like, what if a dev saw this? Would this not be just like a total, I don't know, cheapening of what they spent their hard time on? So to hear that this was kind of like something they thought like, oh, it's great. We want to be something that can be in the background even when you don't want our thing to be our primary focus. Now, the unfortunate thing is, like, I did want to play 14. What I needed to be clearing was Eureka. But it's nice to know that, like, what they intended was maybe I needed a break and I needed to play another game anyway. And so I don't know. I think it's neat to see that they intended that. Thinking about how many content in 14 make you set a specific goal, play towards it, it's something you could totally relax on. Yes, that's the benefit of Eureka. That's the beauty of Eureka. And they wanted you to kind of, you know, check things. He said he actually he was looking at logo stealth and then got caught by stealth detecting monsters. He goes, who put this here? So it is very, very relaxing with that occasional moment of, oh, I almost died. Speaking of stealth detecting enemies, they were placed in such perfect spots. It was placed by the monster team. They've really done it. Yes, I think he does a great job of laughing about when the game gets hard. So if he's in charge of content, just expect there to be a couple of hidden challenging parts. A lot of detections seem to be inspired by 14.2, vision, hearing, magic, life detection. When you play 14, you don't really care for what your enemy sees or hears, so we thought to make it noticeable in Eureka, these types of detections was part of early development as well. I think So as we start to dive into, these are much better questions. When we start to dive into the real meat questions that I was really looking forward to, it's neat to see them say, I want to recreate an 11 tile experience with a 14 style tool set. And so it's neat to see them say, if 14 had existed during 11, what would that have looked like? And so vision, hearing, magic, light detection, these are all things that would have been there. So I think it's awesome that they included capabilities that we have now that 14, I don't know. It feels like that's a very 14 way of doing things, and I look forward to seeing what they do next time. 14 players knew ahead about the magic detecting, but sites like casting rays without realizing that Die Together was frequent right after the release of Animos. I think it was quite a fresh experience. Meanwhile, you mentioned about Kriel's quest wasn't really the quest, but a separate system. How does it work exactly? You know, it's on a totally different platform. Basically, Eureka, once again, just like every other aspect of Eureka, has been their chance to try things. And so they said, we're not sure that it's possible to do the kind of things you want to do and jack with the quest system in this way, but we'll make it happen. And this is what tells them, hey, when we're building future expansions, do we need to build these capabilities in more robustly so that we're not bending them to barely pull off this one quest, but that we can have these pseudo quest lines can be these real quest lines that are scratch built from this new system, instead of it just being, you know, oh, deliver me 12 beans and then go talk to so-and-so and then kill 6 little sheep and then you saved the world. So I think that Eureka is also challenging them on the quest system is fascinating to learn, because the quest system is something that all MMORPGs can struggle with. They can come out with something truly inventive, and then once you've done it 100 times, it becomes old. So continue working on that. I think that, in my opinion, maybe you guys disagree with me, Stormblood was the single greatest leveling experience in Final Fantasy that I've had outside of maybe Final Fantasy X. Like the desire to sit there and just grind my way to the top. I had an absolute blast. So it was definitely better than the previous 2 expansions on the initial level up. So I love to see what they're planning for 5.0, and hopefully some things that they learned from Eureka on a back-end standpoint are going to give them capabilities that then somebody says, oh, now that we have these capabilities, here's these other quests that we could do. There are things we've never even dreamed of. So I hope that we get stuff like that. Will the finale be reachable by simply following story progression? Yes, that makes sense. How far has development for hidatos progressed? As of this, it was almost done. I assume it's done. We heard about something like a public dungeon, and then yes, so the public dungeon is supposed to be this challenging open world dungeon. That's all. This is basically what has been said every time this has come up. So there will be similar parts from previous ones, and also a dungeon plus as a plus alpha. Sounds like it will be difficult to progress from outside to inside. They can't tell us much, but it's supposed to be like an ultimate alliance raid, and I'm really excited about that. More like Savage. So hopefully it's something really challenging. Hopefully it's something that people all really enjoy. That's just the tone that they left on. So the finale is within the next Eureka, which means upcoming hidatos will be the last of the Forbidden Island Eureka. Quite interested in how it will look. It will be the last. If you progress through the story, you'll be able to guess, and that's it. Setting in the Isle of Val was the idea of Mr. Yoshida in the first place, but was the development of the story progression already clear by then? They built the lore around the content that needs to be fought within the island's own rules, so that the rules didn't apply here. So it seems like the function was defined, and then the lore was defined, and then the content made sure to pay respect to both. But the core content seems to be what started, and then the lore went from there. As opposed to sometimes we hear boss fights where it's like, we knew this fight needed to take place, now design a fight. It's interesting to think about, if you guys have ever listened to any of their lore panels. As somebody who's not interested in their lore, I find their lore panels interesting from a storyline standpoint, in the story of creating the content. The story of like, what order do you do things? Mechanics, lore, or lore, mechanics, and different content this team seems to go at different ways. And it really sets the tone. At this point, the story progression took a dramatic turn that came unexpected. Sweet. I never expected and was amazed by the appearance of the four warriors in the dawn for the past Final Fantasy V, even though they were just in silhouette. Foremost, there was no possible way to connect the lore otherwise when it came to Krill, with being the sole survivor of the Isle of Val. Plus, we already established that her grandfather was Gloof Baldason. There you go, guys. Here's your lore questions. So, they haven't revealed the names, but they'll leave it to our imaginations. And they think that there's... seems the appearance of Kelger was possible thanks to the introduction of Lupins in 4.0. And they think it was a pretty good coincidence. Maybe. I would love to see the facial expression that went in with that. I didn't get a chance to see this interview. This is all... I'm reading the translation. And what came out first before the other? The Lupins after the plot development of Eureka, or the Four Warriors of the Dawn after the Lupins? The 4.0 scenario came out first. Keep in mind, the 4.0 scenario is how they said they start out with any expansion. So they define roughly. So they define roughly the lore. Then they say what areas will we need. Then they draw the map. And then they decide what mechanics to fill it in. Then they look for what boss fights and stuff are missing, is kind of how I remember them saying it was done last time. So when you talk about like individual patch content or Eureka content, it's always going to be responding there. But it's an interesting question. There's ways people outside the graphics team can toss in their ideas. It's all about brainstorming ideas, since these are okay to ignore lores in scenario. I think one of the great things about Eureka is that they intentionally wrote it into lore, knowing that they were writing themselves into an open-ended area, kind of. Are there any ideas that actually got implemented? Quite a lot. So I think that they didn't really go into it much because the question was kind of open. It was a yes or no question. Are there ideas, yes or no? Instead of what are some of the ideas that got implemented from this way? So I don't know if that just translated poorly, but like the shape of the question set the answer. So I'd like a follow-up question there if they would. So a lot of good questions so far, though. Might be out too soon, but I'm curious about how the content in the future will be like after experiencing experiences from Forbidden Land Eureka. They're excited about how many people are liking it. Great. But no weapons or armor from outside can be transformed, so you would have to gather materials from monsters on the field for crafter gatherers to provide the weapons. They're starting to talk about like new content, so like new concepts. So this was the initial plan. So the initial plan would have been that you gathered material and then gatherers and crafters were involved. Instead, Disciple Hand and Land felt, in my mind, not as engaged this expansion as they could have, and hopefully next expansion with the with the rebuilding of Ishgard will allow us to... Hopefully that's involved in the relic system, and we're building forges and stuff like that. And I'm sure a lot of people are going to complain, and it's going to be a good expansion to be wealthy in. But if you don't want to level that stuff, but I think it's important to engaging all players that we make our economy and that we start to rely on each other more, not just inside the content. Really push us into guilds and who do you know, and I know a guy that built me my other set. I'm gonna reach out to him and send him a message and see if he can build this next set, and if I buy 2 sets, will he cut me a deal? And oh man, I bought my materials off this guy. He always has extras. Let me reach out and see if he has extras. Those are the kind of relationships that can form that are very much like that Eureka. I recognize somebody that could take place out in the world as a result of this kind of harder that they said got tossed. Our new equipment's level up. Sounds interesting to begin with. I would love to see them bring our relic gear into the next expansion to upgrade. I would love to see a small grind for anybody that doesn't have the relic gear and then make you carry it over. Just kind of talking on that note. And so it sounds like it'll be an experiment at it. I'm excited. So yeah, that's it. So there's your team. There's your guys. That is the very long interview. I skipped over a bunch of stuff. So that's it. That was the team. That was a very long interview with kind of my thoughts. This was just kind of a chance to sit down and have a long conversation with you guys and kind of just talk it out. One what is the story behind Eureka? This is really it. The link is there if you want to read into those questions and the translation. It's quite a bit longer than what I went into, and so I absolutely encourage you to go take a look. My thoughts on Eureka was, with this in mind, that it's so nice to hear about what they were thinking and what kind of the restraints were and like where they could have gone different and why things were certain timelines, because there were a lot of times that I think Brian and I were just scratching our heads wondering why something was the way it was. And some of those things were by design, and some of those things seemed to be, well, the other stuff wasn't ready, and so we pushed it out. And so we were aware of your frustration before you even had it. So where does this leave Eureka in my mind? Well, this does make Eureka a little more palatable in my mind, knowing how hard they worked on it, knowing kind of a little more of the detail in what was leading up to it. It also really gets me excited for 5.0 because the number of things in here where they said we wanted to try this, we wanted to learn from this, we wanted to experiment with this, we wanted to turn things upside down, maybe just for no good reason, maybe for a good reason. Those kind of concepts are what give them the foundation to know where they can take risks in the real content out in 5.0, the open world content, the stuff that's going to be done by every player and not just tried and then ignored if it's not for them. So I would love to do that. I would love to see that. I would love to know kind of what the relic system is going to look like in 5.0, and is it a step forward from Eureka, or is it as much of a step from Eureka as Eureka was from Diadem, where you actually find out later it was built from something different, and anything that you see is like coincidental or maybe like, yeah, it really worked, I guess we could bring it over. That connection after reading this feels weaker than I maybe thought it was. So I would love to know where else they're pulling from than 11. I think that me probably more than Brian, and us more than most Final Fantasy channels, and Final Fantasy channels much more than developers, are willing to talk about the influence that games have on each other, and that game design is not just an empty void and they're all kept in these chambers and they have to design everything in those chambers without talking to anybody. So when you talk about people from Blizzard going to FanFest and people from Square going to BlizzCon, and you talk about, and that's just those two companies, you talk about, you know, Somerset Isles releasing this year, and you talk about Guild Wars 2 doing well, and EVE is, you know, still around and doing great. And then you see things like Destiny 2, which had plenty to learn from, and you see things like Anthem on the horizon, and that's just within games that have literal crossover content where like both games have dungeons, both games have players that are tanks, both games have, so like then you start to talk about, can they be influenced from games outside of this genre? Can they be influenced by, you know, a racing game or a shooting game or anything that they play? I really like the idea of where they said, what would 11 look like if the 14 designers were teleported back in time to compete with 11? So in my mind, when you add Chocobo races, instead of saying add Chocobo races, what would Mario Kart look like if the team from Final Fantasy XIV got teleported back in time to compete with Mario Kart 64? Like, that's what I would love to see them take on. Don't bring Mario Kart 64 into this game exactly. Bring in 14's take on Mario Kart 64. So we might see some of the same things, because yes, they're going to have a battle mode. They're going to have a 50, 100, and 150cc mode, right? And that's fine, but, you know, bring something of yours to it. We talk all the time about Deep Dungeon, and we talk all the time about how there's you know, how there needs to be this kind of Savage Plus 4-mans. You already have the modifiers, right? Heaven on High already has the level modifiers. And you already have various debuffs from things like Eat the Fruit in Aurum Vale or whatever, that you could easily say, I want these modifiers, toss them on these dungeons. And then you can choose a scale. And then within that scale, that'll bump up your eye level or the amount of tomes you get or something like that. So like the tools are all there. And you can take any, like, well, how would that balance even look like? And you can take a little bit of inspiration from other games that have already implemented stuff like this. I know you guys can name a whole list. And then you can say, what is 14's take on it? So I think that Eureka taught them a lot. It's good to see that they're aware and that they're willing to publicly discuss about how much they learned and how they learned it. And I'm really excited for what this means for Shadowbringers and what this means for the remainder of the 4.0 series. 4.5, 4.55 should be great. Hope you guys are enjoying your day off from 14. Hope you guys are having a fantastic time in 4.5 if that's when you see this video. My name is Chris with Work To Game. Thank you guys so much for hanging out, and I'll see you next time.
What's going on, Workforce? Chuck here. It's been a good long month, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for hitting that subscribe button. I just wanted to invite my friend Terry, the T-Rex from Texas, out here. Howdy, y'all. How's it going? This is a really fun end screen video. We should have written a script, right, Chuck? Oh, I agree totally. In fact, I think both our voices sound exactly the same. What are we to do? I don't know. I think we need to get a better voice actor. Yes, I agree. Which one of us is talking? Ah. They're still here. What are we gonna do? I guess we're gonna stop and record.